Alright, so in this video, I've decided to do why I switched to Linux from Windows. So, okay, I made the switch a long time ago, and this is just kind of my experience really quick with it. Um, I was in online courses at a college, and I had to do those courses. And Windows back then, it was Windows XP, so they were having tons of problems with like viruses and Trojans and stuff. And so, and my computer was having issues with something else, and so I decided to give Linux a try. And I downloaded Wooby. I don't think Wooby is made anymore, but it used to install Linux within Windows, so you could try it. And so I thought Linux was working, and it worked with everything, but what I didn't realize was that it was working within Windows. So it was working within a window. And so Windows operating systems would boot up, and then it would work from there. And so I thought everything was working fine, so I wiped my hard drive, and I installed Linux. But I didn't know that you had to compile drivers or anything like graphics card drivers and stuff. I didn't know any of that. So when I went to boot it up, it wasn't working. Nothing pretty much was working, and I couldn't. It took me a while to figure it out, and eventually I did. Using the live CD to go online and look up the problems and the errors and then go back and try to fix that. It was a bit of a pain. And I'm like, what did I do this for? Now I'm going to be running late, and I got my online assignments, and it took me a little while to get it up and running, but then I got my online assignments done. So less than a week. And then, I was piecing stuff together and getting stuff, and there were little things that were a pain, and webcams didn't quite work then, and blah, 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 and Silverlight didn't work out of the box, but I had to come up with solutions to all these problems. And get the webcam to work and stuff, because I needed to eventually be able to do web conferencing and stuff. And so it was just such a pain. And so I decided I'm going to switch back to Windows, but I don't have the money. So I have to make Linux work, because, a couple $100 for Windows, and then, you need the Office program and stuff. And so I toughed it out, and I kept sending the documents to my teacher in the wrong document format, because I was using OpenOffice at the time, and so would send it in a different format. And of course, they were using Microsoft, so Microsoft doesn't play nice with competitive programs because it has the monopoly, so it doesn't have to. So it wouldn't open it. So he knew I sent them in on time, but it just didn't open them. So I had to figure this out and all this. So it was kind of a pain, and ultimately I did figure it all out, and I got graphics drivers working and all this stuff. I eventually did get it. And then I realized from the school that I could purchase Microsoft for $20. I didn't know that. It took me like 6 months. So I had Linux working, and it was running just fine. But I had previously dealt with this pain in the butt stuff of figuring this stuff out. And I decided it might be easier to go back to Windows. That's when this became a nightmare. I got my disk. I was so happy. $20. I had Windows XP, and I had Office, Microsoft Office. Got it there and attempted to install it. And this was the worst nightmare ever. It was a horrible experience. It has to reboot like 50 times during the installation process. It's got to do some stuff, and then it's got to reboot again, and then we're doing that, and that takes forever. And then getting the programs you need. Once it finally does boot, you got to do all this setup and registration, whatever. And then and then you got to do the updates, and oh my God, were those updates horrible. Like, I didn't have the fastest connection in the world, but I didn't have the slowest either. I had broadband back then, about 2005. And so I'm doing this, and it's got to update, and then it's got to reboot, and then it's got to update, and then reboot, and then some updates messed up, and then it's got to redo those updates, and then some updates messed up, and then you got to delete the updates out, and then it's got to reboot, and then it's got to do more updates, and then do its thing, and then reboot, and then I have to sleep, and then I'm trying to do school, and then I got to go to work. And I need this to work because my online college, like, you had a week for assignments, so you have less than a week. I have less than a week to get my computer working. And then you just gotta keep doing all this. And it took, seriously, a week just to get the updates. Like, I didn't have the slowest internet connection either. And it was horrible. It was just a horrible experience. And then the drivers. And then, so we get all these updates that you can, and some had issues and some wouldn't update, and this and that. And then get all these other issues like motherboard drivers not recognized, so certain things are not working, like USB ports might not be working, or I can't remember all in what it was. And then you need certain program to install and to do, update your graphics drivers or something. And then you have to scour the internet and you have to find the brand for these motherboard things and find where they were made and the exact one and whatever, and download the driver for it. It was such a pain in the butt and so hard to do. And then you have to have programs. Like, you need a firewall and an antivirus and all this other crap that you need. And then it was just such a pain. It was a horrible experience. It took forever. And then I thought to myself that I was at least able to get Linux up and running and get some of the things I need in this time. Like, I should have Windows at this point, and like, it kept messing up. So I bought a mouse that had, believe it or not, a Microsoft logo on it. And this mouse plugged into my computer when it updated thought that it was some sort of weird touchscreen that they had back then. Like, I think they had those things, they had two types of touchscreens, I think. You could put one over your computer monitor and it kind of acted like a mouse, more or less, and you could touch it. And then those mouse pads, which you just touched instead of rolled the mouse around. I'm not sure which one it thought it was. So the mouse wasn't working, and it was just all kinds of problematic. And since that didn't happen until after an update, I didn't quite realize what was going on, and it was just a pain in the butt. One of the worst headaches I had ever had to deal with computers, including figuring out Linux and scripting. Like, this was so much worse, and it wasn't even done. So to save my school, my education, get my assignments done on time, I had to, I wiped it. And I thought, yeah, Linux was a problem at first, but once I learned to do it, I could actually install it really quick and get it running. So what took over a week, well over a week, I don't even know how long, with all those drivers issues and everything, for Microsoft and to install XP from scratch on a home-built computer, I could do this in Linux in a couple of hours. And I did. And I had a firewall. Linux has an antivirus. I had all that. A lot of that's built right into Linux, so you don't need to scour the internet for it. Sometimes it's problematic that you have to find a way to turn it on, like the firewall. It doesn't have an actual firewall. It uses the IP tables and open and closing ports to make a firewall. And if you want to have some control over that, you have to download a front end. So that was a bit complicated to find out, but ultimately you just enter that in a Google search and it'll tell you that. Whereas Windows, deciphering problems oftentimes much more complicated. If anyone's had that problem, recognized it, solved it, or whatever. So this is my experience on why I switched back to Linux. And then once I did it, I realized that was a much easier process. And before I uninstalled Windows, I benchmarked. And this was another point. I benchmarked several things, namely transferring files from a USB and downloading off the internet and internet speeds. So I benchmarked all that in Windows and more. Processor speeds and information processing and stuff. And when I was back on Linux and I got it set up, I benchmarked the same things. And since this was about 13 years ago, I don't really remember the numbers on most of it, but the two that it specifically stick out was the internet speed changed. Websites loaded faster, downloads were faster. And I want to say about 2 times faster than they did in Windows. Then I checked the USB, and the USB was 3 or 4 times faster to transfer file. So, and then of course from other hard drives and stuff, this was all faster. And the reason is in my head is that Windows is limited because they're a company. They deal with copyrights, that once they copyright this thing, it's what they have to go with, and if they change it, they have to re-copyright it. They don't always want to do that. Plus, they have only the developers they hire. Linux has hundreds of thousands of developers around the world that contribute code and accept donations for payment, so they don't work for a company. And not only do they contribute code, but they can take their previous code and make it cleaner. So that's my reasoning. I don't know if that's the reason why or if there's other reasons, that it was just so much more efficient. And then at the end of the year, I let the teacher know that I did this Microsoft program, because eventually they taught you to use Microsoft on medical computers. So Microsoft was heavily featured in that degree. He called me a liar because I figured out ways to get Microsoft Silverlight to work on Linux. I figured out ways to get Flash to work. I figured out ways to do the video conferencing all on Linux, and things that just were not at that time thought possible. I figured it out. And I'm like, well, you don't have to believe me, but this is what I've done, and just to let you know, this is possible. And so that's kind of how that went. So that's my experience. And I've stuck with Linux ever since. My original purpose of this YouTube channel was actually to get games that were written for Microsoft to work on Linux. And then I would take clips of me in-game playing, and then I would display that. And then it would link to a how-to forum on how to get that game to work. Rewriting scripts or whatever. I deleted most of those, but there's 1 or 2 still up on my channel. So that's my experience with Linux. This is what converted me over to Linux. I'm glad I did. I still use Linux today. I can't really speak about Windows 10. I know Windows has been taking a page from Linux on quite a few subjects ever since Windows XP. So I know they've copied a lot. In their process. Their new file system is a copy of the Reaser file system on Linux, to try and get some of the advantages that Linux has over Windows. Alright, I'm sure Windows has its advantages too, I just haven't used it. I prefer Linux. Alright, thanks for listening, and hope you have a good day.